Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I got a new book came out. It's available now, pretty much wherever books are sold. The Precession of Sovereignty and the Future of Northern Civilization. I'm going to read you a chapter from it. This chapter is called Cultural Vitalism. According to the great philosophic and religious traditions of every high culture, whether we refer to Oswald Spengler, Rumi, shamans, medicine men, the great philosophers, the Bible, or the Vedas, cultures and their attendant civilizations are born, live, and die, just like any living organism, and they develop, transform, express themselves, and decay through the known life cycles and phases of organic entities, albeit on a somewhat grander scale. Francis Yockey believed that high cultures were actual living spiritual organisms with desires and lifespans. This would go a long way in explaining the phenomena of multiple simultaneous inventions, spiritual teachings, and art form creations, where various individuals, without influence on one another, create, think, and act along the same lines at the same time. A high culture, which we may imagine as an oversoul or a national deity, sends impulses into the human sphere in order to express itself through the human beings in its territory and under its influence, who constitute its cellular structure and physical organs, much the same way a person sends an impulse to their hand so they may grab a coffee mug, or the brain sends impulses to the stomach to govern the digestion of food. Human beings receive inspiration and direction from their cultural oversoul, and those individuals who are most open to these influences, understand them best, and most effectively act on them, become the great heroes, leaders, artists, sages, and inventors of a culture's history. This theory is often referred to as cultural vitalism, and is the foundation for developing a strong historical sense, without which it would be essentially impossible to understand one's place in history. Carrying out responsible and conscientious actions therefore becomes highly unlikely. The lack of awareness of cultural vitalism and the commensurate lack of spiritual attunement to the cultural oversoul explains much of the decadent and foolhardy phenomena that can be witnessed throughout society. Teachers teaching useless subjects and falsehoods, artists creating deplorable works, statesmen making unwise and selfish decisions, inventors being motivated by greed, would-be sages failing in their spiritual ascent, and disseminating false teachings and distortions of truth to unprepared spiritual seekers, among many other such sadnesses and happenstances that I'm sure you can imagine and witness on your own. Such cultural distortions do not arise only during the decadent, dying, old age, senile stage of a high culture's lifetime, although the late stage certainly sees far more distortion than earlier, more vital stages. Distortions may arise at any stage of a culture's history through people who lack awareness, attunement, and historical sense. This is why a cultural elite is so important. They have the responsibility to be spiritually advanced individuals and must guide the masses who lack spiritual development. An elite who lack this finely tuned and hard-won self-awareness, spiritual attunement, and cultural sense will bring calamity and ruin to a civilization beyond the normal decay and decline of natural aging and death. In this world, there exist different strata of life: the mineral, the plant, the animal, the man, the culture man, and the high culture. Unlike these other materially incarnated entities, the high culture is primarily a spiritual entity, and it is not subject to conventional perception. It is generally not something you can see with your eyes, except in exalted states of mystical awareness, or that has a conventional physical form, except as seen in dreams, vivid moments of inspired imagination, and certain paranormal encounters. But just as we cannot see the wind, we can, however, see and hear the leaves blowing in the trees, or a curtain wafting by an open window, or feel it cascading across our skin. We can infer the existence of the wind, and similarly, we can infer the existence of the high culture. We know through intuitive observation and experience what belongs to a particular culture and what does not. The different forms of art, music, spirituality, science, philosophy, architecture, eroticism, style of war, style of techniques, education, society, law, style of imperialism, and so on, all have an internal cohesion that is usually more obvious to the cultural alien than to the members of the culture itself. For example, over the last 1,000 years of history, the Africans, Arabs, and Asians have seen the West as a cohesive unit known as the West. At the same time, Westerners were busy fighting intra-European wars, local kingdom against local kingdom, clan against clan, they saw keen differences amongst themselves. The Celts are different from the Saxons, who are different from the Varangians, who are different from the Slavs, who are different from the Italians, who are different from the Franks, who are different from the Nords, who are different from the Picts, and so on. But to the cultural alien, they were all Westerners, and their cultural forms mentioned above were intuitively coherent and based on similar, if not the same mentality, worldview, and inner experience of reality. It is only very recently that we, as Westerners, have begun to view ourselves as a single unit in the same light, and there's a reason for that. It's due to the natural life cycles and rhythms of the organism known as our high culture. Like any organism, it goes through stages of birth, development, peak, aging, and death, with all of their attendant attitude changes and goal reorientations. These attitude changes and goals, these historical missions that need to be fulfilled, are known as spirits of the ages. Each age that a high culture passes through has a certain spirit, a certain ethos or culture idea that urges us toward its fulfillment, like a desire. In the current age, we have a very keen sense of history, which allows for deep pattern recognition, resulting in cultural self-awareness, hence why we are beginning to see ourselves as the collective West. Less and less do individual Western nations matter to us as sovereign political units, but our feeling of sovereignty in politics is expanding to encompass all Western nations. Our differences melt away and our cultural and political unity takes center stage. The ages of a high culture are generally as follows. An early feudalistic period, characterized by religious feeling and strong social cohesion. Although beginning as tribalistic and fragmented, it is not averse to centralization, and eventually more or less coheres around some form of central authority. New spiritual ideas are generated in the psyches of great individuals. This period coincides with Peter Sorokin's ideational and idealistic truth system phases. Then a period of critical spirituality, more individuality within religion, and the absolute state, which pretends to democracy, characterized by rationalism, skepticism, and atheism, placing the economy as the most important aspect and activity of human life. Politics becomes softened and feminized and replaced with legalism and moralism, and the pursuit of individual happiness is placed above all else, inspiring the systems of capitalism and communism. This period coincides with Sorokin's sensate truth system phase, in which perceptions are rigidified and scientific materialistic ideas predominate. A general anti-spiritual mentality and sense of meaninglessness can very easily take hold of the population, precipitating a crisis of degeneracy, cynicism, and corruption. A dangerous and difficult transition phase is entered now, in which many high cultures find their premature demise. This stage, if the transition is survived, is then followed by a period of the resurgence of authority and deep, re-envisioned spirituality, characterized by penetrating universal wisdom, hard-won by matured skepticism. And with this comes a keen sense of history and pattern recognition and the correction of cultural errors. Think of a middle-aged man who reflects and recognizes the mistakes of his youth and corrects them with discipline and finality. The pursuit of individual happiness and the dogma of scientific materialism are seen as immature, feminine, and foolish, and activity becomes motivated instead by honor, duty, self-awareness, and a sense of historical and spiritual necessity. This is a return to Sorokin's ideational truth system on a higher, more mature octave. And finally, there's a period of universal imperium, initiated by a type of Caesarism, characterized by absolute politics, after which, death from old age, the high culture having fulfilled itself and spread its seed over the world, like a great oak dropping its acorns and distributing the spiritually dense, nutrient-rich compost of its decayed corpse over the world, giving vitality and strength to whichever young high culture is beginning its life, and takes into itself the rich spiritual fertilizer of the passed-on high culture. This is the peak of Sorokin's idealistic truth system phase, the spiritual idealism and seriousness of leaving behind an inspiring legacy, utilizes the remaining stores of the aging high culture's vitality. As individual human beings, we are like the cells that make up the body of the high culture, and it sends impulses, inspiration, and impetus into us to think, act, and speak in certain ways at certain times. The high culture is our governing oversoul, and we are the ones who act in the material world to fulfill the historical mission of our high culture. A culture-bearing individual will attune him or herself to this oversoul and act in accord with it. These people become the great artists, philosophers, inventors, statesmen, warriors, spiritual leaders, and heroes of a culture who make the spirit of the age visible, palpable, tangible, manifest, and actionable to the rest of the human beings within the culture, letting them know which cultural, spiritual, technical, and political directions are healthy to move in that will fulfill the high culture's idea of itself, and which ideas and directions are distortions of the culture and are unhealthy and detrimental to the life of the high culture. Other culture-bearing individuals are the people who enjoy, live by, appreciate, and promulgate the works and ideas of the great and heroic personality types, and are just as important and attuned as they are. They simply did not enter into creative or heroic fields because it was either unnecessary for the culture idea to fulfill itself, or they have other cultural duties to fulfill, like raising a family or living an appropriately healthy conventional life in support of the self-fulfillment of the high culture, according to the ideas made manifest by the works of the creative and heroic individuals. This macrocosmic idea is reflected in the microcosm of an individual. As we age and go through life, we are exposed to ideas that are either from within ourselves or from outside, both helpful and harmful, and we intuitively search within ourselves to regulate our ideas and behaviors so that we act in accordance with what is truthful and authentic for ourselves, to fulfill our idea of ourselves. At least this is what healthy, self-aware, culture-bearing individuals do. Others who are not as self-aware, who are on autopilot, are susceptible to distorting ideas and will act in ways that harm themselves and others and work against the fulfillment of the culture idea, against the spirit of the age. The extent to which you are self-aware is the extent to which you are aware of the high culture. The extent to which you lack self-awareness is the extent to which you are susceptible to the seductive ideas of distorters, aliens, and people who are operating from the ideas of a previous outgrown spirit, of a previous age, which is no longer beneficial, but becomes harmful if it overstays its welcome, much like a 60-year-old with the mentality of a 20-year-old. Now, there are obviously two ways for a high culture to die, just like any other organism. Firstly, of old age after self-fulfillment, or secondly, prematurely, due to illness, hostility, or accident. After the first type of death, the corpse of the high culture is healthy and gives richness to the future of the world. After the second type of death, the remnants of the culture may possibly become pollutants and can cause malady and disease in a new high culture. For just like material organisms, the spiritual organism of the high culture can also suffer pathologies and diseases, but of course these are spiritual pathologies, not physical maladies. These pathologies are culture parasitism, culture retardation, and culture distortion. Culture parasitism is brought into the geographical and political territory of the high culture by the alien, a person who belongs to a completely different culture. For each alien within the geographic territory of a high culture, a person from the high culture cannot be born. If 1 million Africans are living in the heart of Europe, that means 1 million Europeans cannot be born. This is not to say that you should hate the alien or feel anger toward him, for real absolute politics has no place for petty emotionality. It is a simple statement of fact that a foreign entity inside of a host entity which does not assimilate to the host is by its very nature a parasite. This is not a derogatory statement. It is a simple truth. A person does not get angry at a tapeworm. They simply recognize it as a problem which needs a solution, and they take steps toward the solution. There's no enmity, there's no animosity, nor is there any moralism here. It's just simple politics and self-preservation. Cultural retardation manifests in an organism when old, outmoded ways of thinking and acting overstay their welcome, when the spirit of an old age remains in the hearts and minds of some senile people well into the new age and clashes with the principles and ideas of the new spirit of the new age. Our Western culture suffers greatly from this. The 18th century ideas of democracy and liberalism have long overstayed their welcome, as the spirit of the age now is the resurgence of authority. And the idea of capitalism, invented by the British in the 19th century, has overstayed its welcome as well, preventing us from moving into a more ethical and useful form of economics. Liberalism, democracy, and capitalism were created by the age of rationalism, skepticism, and economic thinking, which served us well for a time, but they do not serve us anymore, and are causing serious culture distortion, which costs the physical and spiritual lives and well-being of untold millions of Westerners. The individuals of the 20th century, who were manifesting the spirit of the New Age, albeit in an imperfect and contingent manner, trying to bring about the next natural development of the Western life cycles and rhythms, were ruthlessly thwarted, misrepresented, destroyed, disenfranchised, used as controlled opposition, and in death humiliated and ridiculed by the hate-filled, jealous, avaricious, power-hungry, and terrified culture parasites, culture retards, and culture distorters. Culture distortion comes from both parasitism and retardation. If parasitism and retardation are the cause of the disease, distortion is the disease itself. When a cultural alien lives within a high culture not its own, they may gain benefit from a certain spirit of a certain age of that high culture, and wish to make that mode of activity permanent and prevent the development into a new spirit of a new age, so that they may continuously benefit forever at the expense of the people of that high culture. This is an acute form of parasitism taken to the next level, exploiting the weaknesses of culture retardation. Not only do they displace the high culture's population, but they actively exploit it for their own gain, taking the ideas and wishes of culture retards and surreptitiously enacting them as policy to artificially extend an old age past its expiration date. For example, imagine a race that had its own high culture, but failed to fulfill its historical mission. It met an untimely end before it could die of old age. This culture was at its life cycle stage of the ascendance of economic thinking, i.e. capitalism, communism, rationalism, and democracy, at the moment of its untimely collapse caused by external circumstances or cultural disease. And so this race, in its condition of being an international diaspora, is now permanently locked into this way of thinking and acting to the extent that they generally do not assimilate to the high culture in which they currently live, but remain tribally and ideologically cohesive with each other. The remnants and diaspora of a passed-on high culture tend to remain at the mode of activity they were in at the moment of its death, if that death was caused by anything other than old age. If they adopt the life cycles and rhythms of the new high culture in which they live and totally assimilate to it, accepting their customs, language, traditions, economics, laws, manners, morality, and so on, they are no longer parasites. They are numbered amongst the high culture's population, and there is no problem and no more displacement. But to the extent that they love the economy and place the economy as the highest good and wealth acquisition as the purpose of life, they will use all of their will and resources to artificially keep a high culture in its life cycle stage of economic thinking and rationalism, so that they may continually benefit therefrom. This includes, but is not limited to, the use of propaganda, the infiltration and corruption of academia, the alteration of the historical record, lobbying and infiltration of the government and its attendant think tanks, embedding themselves in the legal system to protect themselves from scrutiny, domination and debasement of the financial system, and the coercion, demoralization, and demonizing of the race belonging to the high culture. A parasite such as this would not benefit from a resurgence of authority, which inherently eliminates the power and thrall of money. Authority places the economy at the bottom of the pyramid of society. The economy is simply a foundation for higher cultural activity and serves no other goal than to allow the fulfillment of the high culture's historical mission. An authoritarian age is concerned with culture, self-defense, and spirituality, not wealth acquisition. Clearly, a capitalist or a communist or a rationalist or a liberal would not benefit from a resurgence of authority. In fact, they will actively oppose this resurgence in order to preserve their own wealth and political power and their need for creature comforts and individual happiness, for they are indeed the natural enemies of authority, honor, and duty. Unscrupulous bankers, financiers, businessmen, kleptocrats, economists, liberals, parliamentarians, and egalitarians despise monarchs, autocrats, charismatic dictators, and aristocratic culture-bearing personalities who would revoke their political access and power over the institutions and people of a society and place them as servants of those institutions and people, or simply eliminate their mediocre ideologies wholesale and demand that they act with honor, duty, spiritual awareness, and discipline. This is the most difficult and dangerous transition in a high culture's life cycle, due to the fact that culture distorters can easily ascend the social hierarchy in the era of rationalism, democracy, and economic thinking using simple financial and bureaucratic tactics. They have vast resources at their disposal and have entrenched themselves into the fabric of civilization by establishing their own institutions and sub-rosa networks. People in general are also very likely to become culture retards in extremely large numbers in such an era, because their animal nature is gratified by the ease with which they may collect money and ascend the hierarchy through bureaucracy and finance. This means that most people have become accustomed to the ideologies of liberalism and economics, and will endeavor to maintain them as part of the culture. This transition is not a simple growth and development or change of mood, as are the other types of transitions. This one is akin to identifying and rooting out diseases and parasites, which are capable of defending themselves. Not only is the transition from rationalism to authority a treacherous and fundamentally transformative balancing act between collectivism and individualism, it is also fraught with the conflict between tradition and innovation, and the recognition of what a good, worthy tradition is versus an outmoded form of activity masquerading as tradition. Discernment is also needed for recognizing a good, worthy innovation from progressive rationalistic nonsense. For example, the American Constitution and similar European documents are products of the age of rationalism and liberalism and serve almost no purpose today, due to the fact that historical necessity and pattern recognition have disproven the dogmatic beliefs in equality, radical individualism, and democracy. These were simply the peculiar religious tenets of a temporary mode of activity, serving a particular purpose in our historical mission, which has already been fulfilled. Radical individualism has turned us into an ocean of atoms in which people strive for sameness, equality, mediocrity, and social acceptance, and shun excellence and uniqueness. Belief in equality and democracy has left us open to attack from culture parasites and distorters who do not share our sense of compassion or tolerance, but will exploit them and use them against us as weapons of guilt and ladders to power. It has also eliminated our ability to act heroically, for to be a hero means to stand out with excellence and uniqueness and take a strong stance against an enemy. But in a democratic society, there is no real enemy to defeat. There are only interest groups to outvote and business rivals to sabotage. Meanwhile, aristocratic, counter-elite, heroic, and creative personalities are largely viewed as the enemy by the culturally retarded masses. The one who controls the media and academia controls the minds of the voters, and to point out this fact does not make you a hero in today's world, but an intolerant bigot who doesn't understand love or acceptance. These so-called traditions of constitutionalism, democracy, and equality are not traditions at all, but anachronisms from an earlier time which did not contain today's historical necessity of authority, of the will to power through merit, spirituality, and self-defense. If we do not claim and express the power which our high culture is so desperately urging us to claim and express, we will succumb to the culture pathologies and surely perish before our time. The question of which traditions should be preserved and which eliminated, and how the preserved traditions should be appropriately transformed to serve the new culture idea effectively in a new age with new circumstances, is one that can only be answered by the culture-bearing stratum of society, who are in tune with the impulses of the high culture. Recognizing these culture bearers and mantling them with absolute authority is the real trick. We must be careful of false messiahs, opportunists, and those who are weak, misguided, and impotent. They are nothing more than liars and fools attempting to, at best, enrich themselves, on the average, maintain the status quo of the previous age, or at worst, destroy our race and civilization. We must learn to recognize the true culture bearers, who are driven by deep instinct and spirit. We must attune ourselves to the spiritual organism of our high culture and discover through intuition and spiritual self-awareness the spirit of the age, and act in accordance with it, and in support of those who would manifest it in this world. So that's a little taste of my book that just came out. It's not for everybody. It's really a book for the counter-elite who are eventually going to replace the current corrupt elite. But anyone can read it. It's definitely, I found it enjoyable to write. I hope you enjoy it too. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good one. I'll see you next time.